In North Carolina, a tragic car accident is blamed for the death of a 45-year-old woman. But a routine investigation and police soon learn that things aren't always as they appear to be. A mother of 6 is found brutally murdered in her Florida home. The forensic evidence points detectives to a suspect, but his whereabouts and the motive behind the murder remain a mystery. For some killers, murder can be a profitable business. And when a victim has been targeted for death, homicide investigators must look beyond the obvious to uncover a murder for hire.
What's up, Panic Fam? I'm Hannah. And if it's 2 a.m., the lights are off and the popcorn has gone cold, you know, it's Panic TV time. Welcome. If you survived this, and this, congratulations, all right? Congratulations, but your luck runs out here.
On the morning of August 23, 1995, a motorist summoned rescue workers and emergency personnel to a remote area off North Carolina's Blue Ridge Parkway. While pulled over at a scenic overlook, she had spotted a van that had plunged several hundred feet down the steep embankment. There was no movement in the vehicle. Transylvania County rescue workers made their way down the cliff, hopeful they would find survivors. When the rescue worker entered the vehicle, a piece of cinder block stained with blood fell out of the van. A woman laid slumped across the front seat. She had suffered massive head injuries. There was no pulse. The body was removed from the vehicle and sent to the morgue for examination. North Carolina State Police began looking for clues to tell them how and why the vehicle went off the road.
I didn't see no skid marks with no plans.
No skid marks or any signs of sudden braking were found. And there were no indications that the driver had swerved off the road. It was likely that the woman had fallen asleep at the wheel or had been under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The van was brought up the embankment for a more detailed evaluation. A check on the vehicle's tags revealed that the van was registered to a man named Edward Kratzer, whose address was several hundred miles away in Bradenton, Florida. After finding no obvious mechanical problems with the van, technicians processed the vehicle. Reddish-brown stains were found on the exterior of the driver's side door. They tested positive for human blood. Inside, they recovered a wallet and driver's license. The driver was identified as 45-year-old Wendy Kratzer, the wife of the vehicle's owner. Blood was found throughout the van. The back of an earring was located on the passenger seat floor. Unsure what to make of the findings, investigators collected several items into evidence. Transylvania County authorities began trying to track down the victim's family to inform them of Wendy's tragic death. At autopsy, medical examiner Dr. Robert Thompson looked to the victim for clues that could explain the crash. He found no traces of drugs or alcohol in the victim's blood or tissue. Wendy's death had resulted from blunt force injuries to the head. She had suffered 5 individual fractures to the top and back of her skull. Though Wendy had not been wearing a seatbelt, for Dr. Thompson, the location and number of injuries were not typical of car crash victims.
Usually injuries that we find with automobile accidents are those in the face areas where the face comes down and hits the dashboard. So the injuries that are found are not really consistent with an automobile accident, although conceivably it could have happened that way.
The autopsy results prompted investigators from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation to take a closer look at Wendy Kratzert's accident. Special agent and blood spatter expert Andy Klein reviewed photographs taken at the scene.
In the passenger side floorboard, and with the wound being to the top and the back of her head, I would have expected to see a larger pool of blood in that floorboard had she received that wound in the van.
More troubling, however, was the presence of the victim's blood on the vehicle's exterior running board.
There was several blood spatters that I noted on the running board portion of the vehicle that would have been protected had the door been shut. So at some point the door was open and she bled on it.
All of the evidence suggested that Wendy Kratzert had been bleeding before she ever got into the van. The routine death investigation had raised more questions than answers. Police learned that Wendy and her husband owned a vacation home a few miles away from the scene of the accident. Later that night, authorities went to the address. No one appeared to be home. Nearby, investigators found the outline of an object. Its shape was similar to the blood-stained cinder block found inside the van. For police, there could be no doubt that Wendy Kratzert had been brutally murdered. After obtaining a warrant, the team made their way into the residence, unsure of what or who they might find. No one was home, and the residents showed no signs of forced entry or ransacking. Investigators thoroughly photographed the scene. They also collected numerous personal items and papers that belonged to the victim. Now, investigators had to determine who had killed Wendy and why. Transylvania County Police were eager to question Wendy's husband, Ed. He was tracked down to his home in Bradenton, Florida. Police there were contacted and asked to speak to the victim's husband. Ed Kratzert couldn't believe his wife had been murdered. He stated that since the couple's children graduated from high school, Wendy had been spending a lot of time at their vacation home in North Carolina. Ed explained that he had recently suffered a heart attack and was at home at the time of the murder. Wendy had helped nurse him back to health. And soon after, she decided to return to North Carolina by herself. Wendy enjoyed her independence. She had even taken a part-time job as a waitress in North Carolina.
Like I said, I don't want to push anything too early right now.
Ed couldn't think of anyone who might want to harm her. Florida police confirmed Ed's alibi, and soon after, he was cleared as a suspect. Police and forensic examiners had exposed a tragic car accident as an elaborate attempt to conceal a brutal crime. But with few leads and no obvious suspects, it appeared that Wendy Kratzert's killer might get away with murder. In Transylvania County, North Carolina, a routine traffic death investigation had 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert had been savagely beaten to death. Her body placed in a van, which was then pushed over a steep cliff. Frustrated by the lack of suspects or an obvious motive, police in Wendy's hometown of Bradenton, Florida, questioned the victim's friends and neighbors. One close friend told police she could think of only one person who might want to harm Wendy, and that was her husband, Ed Kratzert. Wendy had described him as ruthlessly controlling. He watched over her every move and was extremely critical of her behavior. Wendy said he could also be physically abusive. Things had become even more strained after Ed's heart attack. The medical bills had left the couple in severe financial trouble. Just before her death, Wendy had talked about leaving her husband. The findings were passed on to police in North Carolina, where Wendy's murder took place. Following up on the information, investigators learned that Ed Kratzert stood to gain $100,000 from Wendy's death. But so far, he had made no attempts to collect on his wife's insurance policy. Though Ed had misrepresented his relationship with Wendy, he had a solid alibi, and there was no motive connecting him to the crime. Desperate to identify Wendy's killer, detectives questioned her co-workers at the local restaurant where she worked part-time. One recalled that just before her death, Wendy had been tired and irritable. She said she had been dealing with unexpected house guests who had shown up from Florida on a few occasions. The co-worker didn't know the name of the visitors, but it was clear to Transylvania homicide detective Rita Smith that Wendy was not happy to have them in her house.
Wendy had been very uncomfortable with these people, that they had smoked in her house, that she felt that they had pilfered through her belongings.
Looking to identify the house guests, investigators scoured through the items collected from Wendy's vacation home. They found a potential clue. The names Tom and Luana Harrison had been handwritten on Wendy's calendar. And a records check revealed that the Harrisons lived in the same Bradenton, Florida neighborhood as Wendy and her husband. Florida police were dispatched to the Harrisons' home to question the couple. They admitted having visited Wendy in North Carolina a few weeks prior to her death. Tom explained that he and Luana were close friends of the Kratzerts. They spent a lot of time with the couple. They hadn't noticed any problems between Ed and Wendy. Wendy invited them to come stay at their North Carolina home whenever they wanted. She even gave them a key to the house. They took her up on the offer. But that was weeks before her murder. They hadn't been back since. As a matter of routine, the officer asked the couple their whereabouts at the time of Wendy's murder. Tom Harrison suddenly became agitated. He felt he was being treated like a suspect. He ended the interview and asked the officer to leave. Tom Harrison's odd behavior led police to believe he was hiding something.
This timeline here.
To find out what, they subpoenaed his credit card statements for the weeks surrounding the murder. They found that numerous charges had been made to hotels and car rental agencies throughout North Carolina. In fact, the receipts put Tom and Luana Harrison near the scene of the crime in the days before and just after the murder. Tom Harrison had been caught in a lie. Though police could find no motive, the circumstantial evidence was pointing to the Harrisons as Wendy Kratzert's killers. Agents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement were contacted. They were asked to take Tom Harrison and his wife Luana into custody. As FDLE Special Agent Vince 𝐂𝐚𝐿𝐴𝐶 prepared to put his team together, he received some startling news. Tom Harrison was dead.
I'd come in the morning and received a phone call from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. The investigator there asked me if I had seen the front page of the morning paper. The front headline was, "Local man dies in boating accident."
According to reports, authorities had discovered Tom Harrison's boat burning out of control in the Gulf of Mexico. After putting out the blaze, rescue workers began a massive search to find the owner. For several days, efforts to find Tom Harrison turned up nothing. Soon after, the search was called off. The prime suspect in Wendy Kratzert's homicide was missing and presumed dead. Authorities in North Carolina believed they had finally identified the killer of 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert, whose brutal murder had been staged to look like a car accident. But as they prepared to make the arrest, they learned that their prime suspect was missing and presumed dead after his boat was found burning in the Gulf of Mexico. But authorities were convinced that Tom Harrison had staged his own death in an attempt to throw investigators off his trail. Lieutenant Marty Redmond of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission was asked to find out.
When I got to the scene and looked at the boat, I saw a vessel approximately 25 feet long that used to be a cabin-type boat. The boat had burned completely to the waterline, excepting certain portions of the starboard bow and the starboard quarter.
Fire marshals were able to quickly rule out electrical problems as the source of the blaze. After carefully analyzing the burnt remains, investigators found that some places on the boat had burned at a much higher temperature than others. And wood marred with deep, scaly scars, referred to as alligator patterns, was found next to wood that was nearly untouched by the fire. There was only one explanation for the uneven burn patterns.
The fire marshal's office determined that the fire was started with an accelerant, and where in the boat that it was started by indicators from burn patterns, different melting points of certain materials, and other items that they are skilled in looking for in charred ashes or charred remains of fires.
The fire had been intentionally set. And having found no traces of human remains among the debris, investigators were certain that Tom Harrison had set it. Lieutenant Redmond questioned Tom Harrison's wife, Luana. Careful not to reveal that examiners had exposed arson, he asked her about the circumstances surrounding her husband's mysterious death.
We can't close this case out right now.
She claimed that on the night of the fire, Tom hadn't been feeling well. After watching a late-night football game, he told her he wanted to go fishing. Concerned for his health, she tried to stop him. But there was little she could do. Tom packed up his fishing gear and left a short while later. For investigators, Luana did not appear to be the grieving widow who had just lost her husband of more than 20 years. Her only concerns were with quickly closing the investigation into Tom's death. Police soon learned why. In addition to being suspects in Wendy Kratzert's homicide, the Harrisons were in deep financial trouble. And Luana stood to collect a large life insurance settlement as a result of Tom's death. Florida Department of Law Enforcement Special Agent Vince 𝐃𝐿𝐭𝐞𝐿.
But I knew at that point in time that Thomas Harrison was not dead, and that this boating accident was more than likely a staged event, just to hide from the fact that he was a suspect in that case, and probably more than likely, in knowing his situation, that he was looking for some insurance money.
To test the theory, authorities put 24-hour surveillance on the Harrisons' Bradenton, Florida home. Months passed without a break. But then, police spotted Tom Harrison alive and well. And it appeared that he and Luana were preparing to leave town.
Ugh, I swear my neighbors think I'm probably getting murdered right now.
Shortly after the couple hit the road, police pulled them over. Tom Harrison gave the officer a fake name and driver's license. He and Luana were placed under arrest and charged with insurance fraud and arson. But Tom Harrison was uncooperative, and with no hard evidence tying him to the homicide, investigators were still a long way from proving that he had murdered Wendy Kratzert. For police, the Harrisons' close ties with the victim's husband could no longer be ignored. Investigators began to theorize that Ed Kratzert, unhappy in his marriage to Wendy, had hired the Harrisons to kill her.
The time was right to recontact Ed Kratzert, the husband of the victim, and attempt to conduct another interview. With the fact that Harrison had been arrested, we felt as though that would open up the dialogue with Mr. Kratzert.
Kratzert was brought in for questioning and informed of Harrison's arrest. Investigators confronted him with their murder-for-hire theory and insinuated they had evidence to back it up. It was a bluff, but it worked.
Well, he said to me that
Ed Kratzert decided to talk.
I didn't know what he meant by
He confessed to taking part in the plot to murder his wife.
He can not only make it.
He insisted it wasn't his idea.
$100,000.
Kratzert said that he was complaining to the Harrisons about his marriage. He knew Wendy was planning to leave him.
No.
After his heart attack, he was dreading the idea of a prolonged divorce and separation of assets. Tom Harrison told him he could make his problem go away for a fee. Ed agreed. The death was supposed to look like an accident.
Done deal. And he said
When it was exposed as a murder, Ed refused to collect on his wife's life insurance policy.
Make it look like an accident.
The Harrisons were never paid for the job. As a result, Ed feared that Tom Harrison was plotting to kill him. Ed Kratzert was placed under arrest and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Police confronted Tom Harrison with the statements. He refused to cooperate, but it made no difference. The credit card receipts that put him near the crime scene at the time of the murder coupled with Ed Kratzert's confession, was all police needed to charge him with the homicide. Police believe that after showing up unexpectedly at Wendy's North Carolina vacation home, Tom Harrison bludgeoned the unsuspecting woman to death. After the kill, the couple loaded Wendy's body into her van and drove to a remote spot along the Blue Ridge Parkway, where they then attempted to stage her death as a car accident. Ed Kratzert was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife and received a sentence of no less than 11 years. Tom Harrison was sentenced to 20 years. In exchange for her testimony, Luana Harrison received 3 years probation. The Harrisons had tried to get away with murder by staging an elaborate accident. But in 1995, in the suburbs of Sarasota, Florida, one killer made no attempt to cover up his actions. On the afternoon of November 7th, 13-year-old Stevie Bellish returned home from school. No one appeared to be home. But then she stumbled upon a horrifying scene. Her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellish, lay dead on the kitchen floor. Panicked, the young girl called 911. Deputies and forensic technicians from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office were immediately dispatched to the home. To prevent any contamination, a single forensic technician was allowed to enter the residence and document the scene. Sheila Bellish had been brutally murdered. She had suffered a single gunshot wound to the cheek. There were also indications that she had been viciously beaten. Her throat was so deeply cut, she was almost decapitated. As technicians began processing the crime scene, the victim's husband, Jamie Bellish, arrived home. Detectives broke the news. Police assured him that his stepdaughter, Stevie, and the couple's newly born quadruplets were all safe and unharmed. The frantic husband was escorted away from the house and taken to the police station to answer questions. Technicians looked to the blood evidence to help them piece together the events that transpired inside the house. Based on the size and location of blood spatter patterns, they determined that Sheila Bellish was initially shot near a door that led to the laundry room. Streaks of blood suggested she then attempted to crawl away from her attacker. But she was only able to get a few feet away before her killer caught up with her and slashed her throat. There was nothing to suggest that robbery was the motive. In the laundry room adjacent to the kitchen, technicians located a single .45 caliber shell casing. A few feet away lay a white towel. Some of the fabric was covered with gunshot residue, suggesting it had been used as a makeshift silencer. But for some reason, the killer only got off one shot before using a knife to finish the job. Evidence technician Lisa Lanham tried to make sense of the excessive violence inflicted on Sheila Bellish.
There are two possibilities of why he abandoned the gun. One is that the gun is very loud in a small confined area and probably sounds even louder when you're the one shooting it, and he may have feared that the neighbors would overhear the weapon. The other possibility is that the towel got caught in the gun and then basically made the gun inoperable.
Looking for any trace of the killer that may have been left behind, technicians collected dozens of prints from throughout the residence, including some found inches from the bullet casing. all of the evidence was forwarded to the Sarasota County Crime Lab. Homicide Detective Chris Iorio was assigned lead detective on the case.
All I knew at that point was we did have a mother of 6 kids deceased in the kitchen, head trauma, most likely a gunshot was involved, and we took it from there.
Investigators know from experience that their best opportunity to solve a murder falls within the first 24 hours. With few clues and no obvious suspects, they hoped an autopsy could point them to this brutal killer. Police in Sarasota, Florida struggled to find answers in the death of 35-year-old Sheila Bellish, a mother of 6 found brutally murdered in her home. At autopsy, the medical examiner recovered a .45 caliber bullet that had been fired from close range into the victim's face. It had shattered her jaw, but it was not the cause of death. A single knife wound had severed the victim's left and right jugular veins. Sheila Bellish had bled to death. There were no signs of sexual assault, and no clues to the killer's identity were found. The overkill observed at the crime scene led police to suspect that the killer was someone close to the victim. Sheila's husband, Jamie Bellish, was brought in to answer questions. He described Sheila as a dedicated mother and a loving wife. Jamie explained that he and Sheila and her 2 children from a previous marriage had recently moved to Florida from San Antonio, Texas. Sheila had just been through a nasty divorce. And when she and her new husband learned they were going to have quadruplets, they decided to start their lives over in a new city. The decision to move had not been an easy one. But according to Jamie, Sheila's ex-husband continued harassing her, even after the divorce was finalized. Jamie said that at the time of the murder, he was at work. But homicide detective Chris Iorio was taking nothing for granted.
At the beginning of the case, Jamie Bellish was our obvious suspect due to just his role in the family structure, but within, I'd say, 4 or 5 hours after we responded, we felt pretty sure that he was not involved.
Detective Iorio contacted authorities in San Antonio, Texas, and asked them to speak with Sheila's ex-husband about the murder.
Okay, how about...
Well, sure, I keep all my records. Would you like to see them?
Alan Blackthorne, a wealthy businessman, admitted that his divorce from Sheila had been bitter. But he insisted he never would have harmed the mother of his children. At the time of the murder, he was on a golfing trip in Arizona, and he had the receipts and documents to prove it.
And did anybody travel with you on this flight?
With no suspects and no obvious motive for the killing, Sarasota police turned to the physical evidence for clues. Examiners found a fingerprint that did not match any of the Bellish family members, and it had been found just inches away from the spent bullet casing. The evidence put investigators one step closer to identifying Sheila's killer. Now they needed to find out who had left that print. Detectives returned to the Bellish neighborhood to question residents about the day of the murder. One recalled seeing a Hispanic man dressed in military camouflage getting out of a white car and walking through the neighborhood. The neighbor didn't get a good look at the man's face, but was able to recall a few numbers from the license plate.
When we heard about a Hispanic male walking through the neighborhood in camouflage, we knew that most likely he didn't belong to that neighborhood. It was mostly a retirement community, and nobody wears camouflage in this heat. And evidently it was a long-sleeve shirt, long pants, and that just stood out.
A description of the man and details of the homicide were released through area newspapers. A short while later, police got a tip. A clerk who worked at a convenience store a few miles from the crime scene told police that he also saw the Hispanic man dressed in camouflage around the time of Sheila's murder.
I showed him some directions on the map.
The man had come in looking for directions. In fact, he was trying to locate the neighborhood where the young mother was found murdered.
Make your first left, and the next right.
The clerk handed the man his laminated map of the area. He added that the stranger got into a white car and drove off. Officers collected the laminated map, hopeful the suspect had left his prints behind. At the crime lab, examiners located several prints on the map. Evidence technician Lisa Lanham then compared them to the suspect's prints that were recovered from the crime scene. She found a match. Police had identified a suspect and had evidence that could tie him to the crime scene. Now they needed to know his name. All they had was a partial license plate number from his vehicle. It wasn't much to go on.
We initially ran a tag out of Florida. I mean, a lead's a lead, you have to try. And it came back to nothing. And then we decided, since the Bellishes were from Texas, that'd be the next state to try. And when we got that tag, the information back, it was registered to somebody in Texas, so we had to follow up that lead.
Investigators traced the white vehicle to a 21-year-old Austin, Texas resident named Jose Joey Del Toro.
We ran a background check on Jose Del Toro. As soon as we got his name, we did find out that he had a criminal history, but nothing that would make you believe he was a murderer.
But that was a conclusion forensic scientists would have to make. Joey Del Toro's fingerprint card was forwarded to the Sarasota County Crime Lab. There, examiners compared his prints to those recovered from the Bellish home. After careful scrutiny, they concluded that Joey Del Toro had left the print. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Police in Del Toro's hometown of Austin, Texas, were unable to track down the suspect. However, they did manage to locate his white vehicle. Armed with a warrant, investigators processed the car. Inside a bag, they collected a Colt .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. It was the same type of weapon used to shoot Sheila Bellish. To nail their case against Joey Del Toro, investigators forwarded the weapon to ballistics experts at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. First, the weapon was fired into a water tank. The water slows the bullet's flight without distorting the unique marks left behind as it passes through the gun barrel. The rounds collected from the water tank could then be compared to the bullet recovered from Sheila Bellish's cheek. Under a comparison microscope, examiners found that the striation marks that are unique to each gun were identical on both bullets. All of the forensic analysis left investigators with no doubt that Joey Del Toro had murdered the young mother of 6. But having found no obvious connection between the killer and the victim, the motive behind the savage slaying was as mysterious as the killer's whereabouts.
If you could slap one character for their dumb decisions, who would it be? Huh? Go on. Vent in the comments. I can't wait to read.
Police in Sarasota, Florida, had finally linked a suspect to the murder of 35-year-old mother of 6, Sheila Bellish, found brutally beaten, shot, and stabbed in her home. All of the evidence suggested that 21-year-old Joey Del Toro committed the murder and then fled to Texas. But so far, all efforts to locate him had gone unsuccessful. Then, police got a tip that the fugitive was staying with relatives in San Antonio. For help, Florida police contacted the Texas Rangers stationed there. But authorities there had no luck finding the suspect. However, they managed to track down his cousin, a man named Sammy Gonzalez. He agreed to come in and answer questions. Texas Rangers Lieutenant Gary De Los Santos conducted the interview. Sammy Gonzalez claimed he had no idea where his cousin Joey Del Toro might be. But he believed he had information about the murder. He said that a few months back, an acquaintance of his, a golf hustler named Danny Rocha, had tried to hire him to beat somebody up. Sammy was interested in the job, but when he saw the intended victim, he declined. But he knew someone else who might be interested in the job.
Sammy admitted to us that he was approached by Danny Rocha and was asked to beat up a girl. Once Sammy realized it was a woman, he refused to do it, but he brought up to Joey, his cousin Joey Del Toro, that maybe he would be willing to do it.
Sammy claimed that he didn't know if his cousin had taken the job, and he didn't ask why the woman had been targeted. Unsure what to make of the information, investigators began digging into the golf hustler's background. They were surprised by what they found. Danny Rocha was a close associate of Sheila Bellish's wealthy ex-husband. Suddenly, investigators had to consider that they had exposed a murder-for-hire scheme. Police knew that Sheila's divorce had been bitter. But had it led to murder? One friend who knew the couple well thought so. Sheila had described her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne, as obsessive and controlling. During their divorce, he had demanded that Sheila sign over custody of their children. When she refused, Blackthorne had her falsely arrested for child abuse. The charges were ultimately dismissed, and Sheila was awarded custody of the children. Alan Blackthorne allegedly said that he would get even. According to the friend, Sheila took the threat seriously. When Sheila and her new family moved to Florida, they kept an unlisted phone number and took pains to keep their new address a secret. Now, investigators looked for proof that the victim's ex-husband had orchestrated her murder. Danny Rocha, the person police believe had hired the hitman, was brought in for questioning. Under advice of his attorney, he refused to answer any questions. Before letting him go, however, Lieutenant De Los Santos asked Rocha to pose for a photograph with him. He agreed. The following day, Sammy Gonzalez was brought in for another interview. Police were convinced he knew more about the murder plot than he claimed. When shown the photograph, Sammy became convinced that Danny Rocha was cooperating with authorities. Fearing he had been implicated in the murder, he decided to talk. Now, he admitted that he had accepted $14,000 from Danny Rocha to murder Sheila Bellish. A short while later, he hired his cousin to actually carry out the homicide. Sammy believed that Sheila Bellish's ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne, had ordered and financed the murder. He He also told investigators where they could find the hitman, Joey Del Toro. Soon after, Del Toro was tracked down to a motel in Mexico. He was placed under arrest and, after extensive legal wrangling, extradited back to the United States to stand trial for murder. Authorities had now exposed 3 conspirators in the murder of Sheila Bellish. But the alleged mastermind, Alan Blackthorne, was still a free man. Looking to find evidence linking him to the murder, investigators subpoenaed his phone records for the months prior to the homicide. One number that continually popped up was traced to the bail bondsman who had helped Sheila get out of jail when she was falsely arrested. The bondsman said he recorded all of his phone conversations. Police realized that he would have been one of the few people to have a record of Sheila Bellish's most current address.
Once we got those recordings, that's when you hear Alan Blackthorne, and there's a person calling in pretending to be somebody else and trying to ascertain Sheila's address.
Investigators confirmed that just before the murder, Alan successfully located Sheila's Florida address. The evidence, along with the testimony of the other conspirators, was enough to arrest the wealthy businessman. On January 4th, 2000, Alan Blackthorne was taken into custody and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. At trial, police learned that soon after his divorce from Sheila, Alan Blackthorne began plotting to kill her. While on a golfing trip, Blackthorne told his associate, Danny Rocha, that his ex-wife was an abusive mother and he wanted it stopped, even if it meant killing her. Danny Rocha agreed to set it up. After acquiring Sheila's address in Florida, the hitman drove from Texas to the Bellish home. Joey Del Toro broke into the residence and waited for his opportunity. He caught the unsuspecting mother completely off guard. For their role in the murder, Joey Del Toro and Danny Rocha each received life sentences. Sammy Gonzalez was sentenced to 19 years. Alan Blackthorne was found guilty of orchestrating his wife's death and sentenced to life in prison. For some, money is motive enough to commit murder. When there are no obvious connections between killer and victim, detectives turn to forensic examiners to expose the mastermind behind a murder for hire.
Be honest. Did you watch the last scene through your fingers? Comment yes or no.